What park rangers discover after midnight in Yellowstone will shatter everything you thought you knew about America's oldest national park. Welcome back to Mr.Darkmare. Tonight, we are diving into 7 verified accounts from Yellowstone rangers, incidents so disturbing they were deliberately kept off public record. These aren't folklore or campfire tales. These are documented testimonies from trained professionals who witnessed events that their emergency protocols couldn't explain. Every story you're about to hear comes from official ranger reports, internal documentation, and first-hand witness statements, cross-verified wherever possible to separate myth from the horrifying patterns that keep surfacing in the same locations, the same thermal zones, the same forgotten valleys. Yellowstone markets itself as nature's wonderland, but the men and women who patrol its boundaries after dark know a different truth. Some incidents never make the visitor brochures, and some encounters leave psychological wounds that don't heal when summer ends. If you're drawn to authentic horror grounded in real testimony and meticulous investigation, subscribe to Mr. Darkmare and activate notifications so you never miss our latest exploration into the darkest corners of the natural world. After hearing these confessions, drop your own park experiences or family stories in the comment section. Because when we compare these accounts, a disturbing truth emerges. Something out there is watching back. Now settle in as we open the case files on Yellowstone and listen to what its rangers were never supposed to reveal publicly. Story 1. The voice in the Giza Basin. My name is Ryan, and I used to believe Yellowstone was a place I completely understood. On paper, I represented exactly the type of person you'd trust in remote wilderness after dark. Former emergency medical technician, seasonal ranger for 3 consecutive years, the person who constantly quoted regulations and dismissed ghost stories the veteran staff shared around campfires. That perspective shifted during a Tuesday shift in late September. The evening a routine welfare check in the upper Giza Basin transformed into something I still can't describe without my hands trembling uncontrollably. It began with what appeared to be a standard call. Day shift had received a report from a hostel in West Yellowstone regarding a solo traveler who hadn't returned before closing time. A woman in her 30s, hiking boots, compact day pack, numerous Giza photographs on social media. Her last confirmed location was near one of the boardwalk loops, departing just before sunset. By the time my shift started, her vehicle remained in the parking lot and she hadn't answered her phone. During busy weekends, that scenario can mean a missed bus or dead battery. In September, with a cold front approaching and fewer crowds to blend into, it gets elevated priority. I volunteered to walk the basin. I told my supervisor it would provide good exercise and that the missing hiker would probably be sitting on a bench somewhere, wrapped in a sweatshirt, embarrassed when I appeared with a flashlight and a radio. That was genuinely what I believed as I parked near the trailhead and stepped out into that particular type of darkness you only experience around thermal features, where steam swallows distance and light simultaneously. If you've never been in a Giza Basin after closing, there's no adequate way to describe how unsettling it feels. The same locations that appear magical in postcards begin to feel like gaping mouths. The boardwalk creaks under your boots, and every hiss of steam sounds like something inhaling. The air smells like sulfur and heated metal, and the temperature oscillates between frigid and almost feverish, depending on where the wind pushes the vapor. My headlamp beam carved a narrow tunnel through the fog, pulling pale shapes of railings and warning signs from the darkness. I walked the upper loop first, calling her first name every few minutes the way we are trained to do. Nothing responded except the constant bubbling of pools and the occasional low roar of a vent. I checked every bench, every small spur trail leading to an overlook. No pack, no person, no dropped phone. I kept reassuring myself that this was positive, that no sign meant she was probably already somewhere warm and frustrated with poor reception. Halfway down the main stretch, I saw it. A dark shape on the boardwalk just past one of the stay on trail signs that visitors photograph for social media. For a second, my brain insisted it was just another shadow cast by my headlamp. But as I approached closer, the outline sharpened. A boot, brown leather, women's size, lying sideways with the laces splayed like it had been removed hastily. I crouched beside it and felt the first genuine knot of unease. The boot was warm, but not from a foot. The sole had absorbed heat from the boardwalk. A folded park map lay beside it, weighted with a small rock, as if someone had deliberately arranged those items there to be discovered. The hair on my arms stood up. People drop gear constantly, but they don't usually position it. I swept my headlamp over the gap between the railings and the thin crust beyond. At first, I saw only steam and the faint shimmer indicating the ground carried more heat than it should. Then my beam caught something else. A pair of shallow drag marks starting at the edge of the planks and running out across the pale surface until the fog consumed them. Not footprints, not animal tracks. Two wide lines like something heavy had been pulled or dragged. Training activated. I keyed my radio and gave my location. Told them I had personal effects likely belonging to the missing hiker and possible sign of off-trail travel. My supervisor's voice came back calmer than I felt, instructing me to hold position, not to attempt a rescue on unstable ground, and that he was dispatching another ranger with thermal imaging from the parking lot side. Standard, reassuring, familiar. What wasn't familiar was the way the steam shifted as I waited. It usually blows with the wind in long, predictable currents. That night, it seemed to twist in small circles around the drag marks, thickening until the beam from my headlamp bounced directly back at me. The basin went strangely quiet. The constant small sounds of boiling water and hissing vents dropped into a kind of muffled silence, like someone throwing a blanket over a running engine. That's when I heard my name. It came from the fog beyond the boardwalk, from the direction of the drag marks. Ryan. Clear, calm, exactly how my supervisor pronounces it when he wants my attention during a briefing. The cadence, the slight downward inflection at the end. All of it identical. I did what anyone would do. I lifted my radio. "Yeah, I copy," I said, feeling stupidly relieved. "I'm still at the last coordinates I sent. You almost here." There was a pause. Then his actual voice came crackling through, sharpened with confusion. "Repeat last, Ryan. I didn't call you. I'm still 5 minutes out from the lot." I stared at the radio, then back at the fog. There had been no static in the voice I heard, no electronic distortion. It had come from the air itself, from the white wall in front of me. I told myself I was exhausted, that the sulfur smell was causing a headache, that I had misheard some shifting of steam and distant conversation. I told myself many things in the next 30 seconds that I no longer believe. Ryan. The second time was closer. Right at the edge of the boardwalk, somewhere below eye level. The same familiar tone, but there was something underneath it now. Something like a whisper riding just behind the main sound. I stepped backward without intending to, the boards creaking under my boots. Every rule we have drilled into us about staying on the walkway started flashing through my head. Thin crust, scalding pools. People who die out here don't go quickly. The training videos show pictures they usually don't show the public. Skin that appears boiled, clothing melted to flesh. The rational part of my brain told me that if the missing hiker had gone over, she was already beyond help. The rest of me was listening to my own name being spoken in a voice that knew exactly how to make me trust it. I swept my light slowly along the gap again, forcing my hands to stay steady. For a moment, there was nothing but swirling white. Then, for just long enough to register, the steam thinned. Something was out there on the crust. Not standing, not exactly. It looked like a human figure hunched low, one arm extended toward the boardwalk. The skin that showed in my light was pale in some places, dark and wet in others, as if parts of it had cooked and sloughed. The face, if that's what I was seeing, was turned away. What caught my attention more than anything was the fact that the figure was not where any living human should have been able to stand. The crust there was thin enough that even a bison can punch through. I knew that from rescue training. I knew it in my bones. The steam rolled back over it in a gust of sulfur and heat, hiding everything. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. I must have made some kind of sound because the voice in the fog changed. It stopped sounding like my supervisor. The structure of the words stayed the same, but something in the pitch slid sideways, like a recording slowing down and speeding up simultaneously. "Please," it said. "You have to come off the boards. I can't reach." There was a note in that last word that made every instinct in me rebel. I've worked enough trauma calls to recognize genuine panic. This wasn't it. There was no urgency, no stumbling over syllables, no breathlessness. It sounded like someone doing a very good impression of distress without understanding what it actually feels like. I don't know how long I stood there, breathing in shallow sulfur-tainted gasps, staring into a blank wall of white. I remember thinking about all the stories rangers tell each other at the end of the season. The disappearances that never added up, the search grids that turned up neatly stacked clothing with no footprints leading away. The half-joking way people would say the park takes who it wants. I used to hate that phrase. That night, it wrapped around my ribs like a hand. I forced myself to talk. If you can hear me, you need to move toward my voice without leaving solid ground. I can't come out there to you. The boardwalk is the only safe area. Ryan. This time it was almost a hiss. The voice cut across mine, sharp and irritated, like a parent silencing a child. You don't leave people behind. It knew my training. It knew exactly which string to pull. In emergency medical technician school, they hammered a particular line into us. You don't abandon a patient who is still viable. I had repeated that line out loud in more than one debrief. I had never said it around my current crew. Hearing those specific words thrown back at me in the fog snapped something I didn't realize was brittle. I took another step back. My heel hit the upright of a safety sign and stopped me. The boardwalk behind me curved away into the dark. Ahead of me lay nothing but steam and those twin drag marks whispering into the unknown. For a second, I truly believed that if I stayed where I was, something would eventually reach up through that gap and grab my ankle. The urge to run fought with the urge to freeze. Headlights cut through the trees behind me, spattering weak light across the rails. Another ranger's voice came over the radio, this time in the normal way, wind noise and all, asking for my exact position again. The spell broke like glass. I'm by marker 7 on the upper loop, I said, louder than I meant to. Advise extreme caution. I have probable fatality off boardwalk, unstable ground, and auditory anomalies. I hated the way that sounded, but there was no other phrase that fit. As soon as I spoke to someone who was verifiably real and approaching, the basin changed. The ambient noise returned in a rush. Gurgling pools, distant loud vent, the small crackle of cooling boards. The steam in front of me started moving with the wind again. No more circular eddies, no more voice. My partner joined me within a couple of minutes, his face pinched against the smell and the cold. We secured the area, logged the location of the boot and the map, and did what we could from the safety of the planks. Thermal imaging picked up an irregular hot mass beyond the edge of the boardwalk, right where those drag marks disappeared. A specialist team with the right gear confirmed what we already suspected the next day. Human remains, not intact, not accessible without risking another life. The official report says the missing hiker disregarded multiple warnings, left the designated path, and fell through thin crust into a scalding runoff channel. It lists the cause of death in clinical terms I'm not going to repeat. There's no mention of the arranged boot, the map weighted down with a rock, or the voice that said my name before anyone had broadcast over the radio. There's certainly no line about a shape in the fog standing where no one should stand. People ask why I left after that season. I tell them it was burnout, that I wanted steadier work, something closer to family. All of that is true. It's not the whole truth. The part one don't say is this. A week after the recovery, I woke up in my apartment in town to the smell of sulfur and the sound of somebody whispering my name from the corner of the room where the otter steam from my shower usually hangs the longest. The window was closed. The vent was off. There was no visible fog. Just that voice, patient and amused, saying, "You don't leave people behind, Ryan." Not even when the boards end. I moved out of Yellowstone the following month. I haven't set foot on a Giza Basin boardwalk since. And on cold nights when condensation crawls across the bathroom mirror and I see shapes in it that don't quite match my own reflection, I remember the drag marks and the hand reaching from impossible ground. And I wonder how many stories we've written off as visitor error that were actually something else reaching through the fog, learning how to sound like the people we trust most. Story 2. The forest that refused to burn. I used to love the smell of smoke. Most people hear that and think of house fires or cigarettes, but for me it was always campfires and controlled burns. That sharp, dry scent that meant the forest was doing what it needed to do. Fire is part of the cycle. That's what they teach you in ranger training. What they don't teach you is what happens when something refuses to burn. My name is Ella, and the last season I worked in Yellowstone, I was assigned to monitor a burn scar that never behaved the way it should have. The summer before, a lightning strike had taken out a big chunk of forest on the edge of my district. It had been a hot year. Dry needles piled deep, and even with the best efforts from the crews, it ran hotter and longer than anyone liked. By the time it was out, the hillside was a skeleton. Black tree trunks, ash drifting underfoot. The earth itself baked into hard, cracked plates. Ugly, but ecologists were excited. That kind of disturbance opens up light for new growth. Life follows fire. That's the cycle. My job that fall was simple on paper. Hike the perimeter, document regrowth, flag hazard trees, and make sure tourists weren't wandering into unstable areas for the perfect Instagram shot. I spent weeks crunching over charcoal, taking notes on tiny shoots of green pushing through the ash. It felt hopeful in a way. The forest was wounded, but it was healing. There was just one exception. The first time I saw the spared place, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had been following a GPS line along the upper edge of the burn, the black scar on one side, unburned forest on the other. It was tedious work, side-hilling on loose soil, breathing in dust that tasted faintly of old smoke. I came around a bend between two big granite outcrops and had to stop because ahead of me the world was wrong. Imagine walking through a war zone and finding one untouched house in the middle of the rubble. That's what it felt like. The whole slope had burned hot all the way to the ridge line, except for a roughly oval patch the size of a small meadow. Inside that boundary, the trees were green. The ground was covered in moss. Fallen logs lay intact instead of reduced to white ash. It looked like a piece of forest someone had cut out from a photo taken years earlier and glued over the present. I checked my map twice to make sure I wasn't just misreading an edge. The burn perimeter line on the tablet ran right through where I was standing. According to the data, this spot should have gone up like everything else, but the trunks at the boundary told a different story. They were charred black on the outside, yes, but only on the side facing out. The inner halves were untouched, bark still rough and living under my hand. I stepped closer, boots leaving prints in the ash until I hit the line where the ground changed. On one side, grey dust puffed up around my laces. On the other, the soil was damp and springy, a thin layer of green moss damping my footsteps. The air felt cooler inside that invisible circle, quieter somehow. Even the distant sound of the wind seemed to dim. In the center of the spared grove was a cluster of stones stacked in a low ring, about knee-high. Not quite a fire ring, not quite a cairn. For larger rocks formed the corners of what could have been a square if it had been laid out more precisely. Someone had taken time with it, though. The stones weren't random. They were chosen, flatter faces inward, lichen scraped off in places to reveal pale granite beneath. I walked around it once, counting my steps. 12 paces across in any direction. The middle of the ring was bare earth, darker than the soil outside, and just damp enough to hold the impression of my boot when I tested it. No sprouts, no needles, just that dark circle of exposed dirt. On the second circuit, I noticed the carving. It was on the inside edge of one of the cornerstones, not obvious unless you were standing in the ring and looking down. A smooth oval had been scraped clean, and in the center of that, someone had cut a simple shape, a vertical line with two short bars crossing it near the top. It could have been a crude tree, or a figure with its arms raised, or nothing at all if you were feeling generous. The grooves were shallow but sharp, like they had been made with a good knife and a patient hand. I should have left it alone. I know that now. At the time it felt like a find, a human element in an otherwise impersonal assignment, something I could photograph, log, and maybe joke about later back at the station. Found some backcountry art in the burn, that sort of thing. Instead, I did something stupid. I reached down and brushed my fingers over the carving. A small flat disc of stone, about the size of a coin, broke free from a crack near the etched lines and dropped into my palm. It was oddly smooth on one side, rough on the other. The same symbol was scratched into its face, more hastily, like a quick copy. I turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into the breast pocket of my uniform shirt. I don't know why. Maybe I thought of it as a piece of the story of this place, a little talisman from a forest that had refused to burn. Maybe I was just tired and not thinking clearly. On my way out of the grove, I almost walked into another ranger. He was one of the old-timers. Grey beard, leathery face, the kind of man who had a story about every rock and ridge. I had seen his name on rosters, shared radio channels with him, but we had never spent much time in the field together. He stood just outside the green boundary, boots planted in ash, eyes fixed on the stone ring behind me. "Did you step in there?" he asked. I stopped. "Yeah, just documenting. It's strange how it missed this spot." He nodded once, slowly. "We call it the spared place," he said. "Locals had other names for it long before the park. You shouldn't linger." I tried to keep my tone light. "Well, the fire seems to agree with them. Did you see that ring before the burn?" His gaze flicked to my chest just for a second. Later, I would wonder if he had seen the slight bulge the stone disc made in my pocket. "Some things stand where they stand," he said. "Fire goes around. That's all you need to put in your report." It bothered me on the hike back that he hadn't answered my question. It bothered me more that every time I looked over my shoulder, it felt like the ring of stones was closer to the edge of the burn than it should have been, like the blackened trunks had leaned back a step to make more room for it. That night at the cabin, I couldn't stop thinking about the grove. I should have been exhausted, but my body hummed like I had drunk too much coffee. The little stone token sat on the table beside my bunk, catching the light from the lantern in a way that made the scratched symbol seem deeper. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of fire. Not the roaring wall of flame you see on the news. This was a slow, crawling burn, tongues of orange licking along the forest floor, turning needles and deadfall into glowing lines. I was standing in the middle of it, watching trees crack and fall, hearing animals fleeing in the dark beyond the light. Only the heat never touched me. It rolled around me like water around a rock, biting at the edges of whatever invisible circle I was standing in, but never crossing it. Somewhere in the smoke, I heard a voice I couldn't quite make out, as if someone was speaking on the other side of a closed door, just loud enough for me to know I was being addressed. I woke up with my heart pounding and the taste of ash in my mouth. The cabin smelled faintly of smoke, but that wasn't unusual. The old would absorbed decades of it. What was unusual was the way my breath steamed in the air, even though the thermometer on the wall said it was 60 degrees inside. My skin felt prickly, like I had just walked in from a cold day. But when I touched my arm, it was warm, almost too warm. I told myself it was a bad dream and got ready for the day. The stone went back into my pocket without me really making a conscious choice. It felt wrong to leave it behind. The strange things started small. On my next hike into the burn, the air around the spared grove felt a few degrees warmer than the rest of the slope, even though the sun was behind clouds. My water bottle was lukewarm when I pulled it from my pack near the boundary, as if it had been sitting near a stove. When the wind picked up, ash whirled across the hillside, but none of it crossed into the green patch. It hit an invisible line and swirled away, piling in little drifts along the edge like snow against a fence. I laughed it off over the radio the first time I mentioned it. Blake, that was the older ranger's name, didn't laugh back. "Just do your job and leave it be," he said. "Places like that have their own arrangements." Arrangements. It was such a strange word choice that it stuck with me. Arrangements with what? Fire, the land, something else? The second night, the smell woke me. Strong this time. Not cabin smoke, but fresh burning, sharp and dry, carried on a wind that rattled the windows. I rolled out of bed, sure there had been a spot flare somewhere near the cabin, and grabbed my boots. By the time I reached the door, the smell was gone. Outside, the stars were clear, the air cutting cold. No glow on the horizon, no distant crackle. Back in my bunk, the immediate danger gone, I realized my pillow was hot. Not just warm from my head, hot, like it had been sitting in the sun. My hand came away slightly damp, and for a panic moment, I thought it was sweat, until I saw the faint grey smudge on my palm. Ash. I started to put the stone on the floor, then to get it away from me, but the idea made my chest tighten with an irrational surge of panic. I compromised by wrapping it in a bandana and tucking it deeper into my pack, telling myself I would drop it off at the station as an interesting find later in the week. On the third day, I realized I wasn't alone in the spared grove. I had gone up alone, Blake covering another section. Morning light slanted through the black trunks, turning the burned scar into a forest of thin shadows. Inside the green oval, the light was softer, muted by live needles. I walked to the stone ring, counted my usual 12 paces across, and crouched to take another series of photos for comparison. That's when I felt it. The very faint sensation of someone standing just behind me. It wasn't a sound at first, more like the subtle shift in air you feel when another body moves into your space. The hair on the back of my neck lifted. My throat went dry. I told myself it was just the way the breeze funneled between the rocks, the temperature difference between burned and unburned ground. I didn't turn around. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice even. "Blake, if that's you, this is a lousy joke." No answer. The sensation of presence stayed, a pressure between my shoulder blades. Slowly, I stood, camera dangling from its strap. My boots felt heavier than they should have. The symbol on the stone token in my pack seemed to buzz against my spine, even though I knew that was impossible. "I know you're there," I said. "You're not supposed to be in this area. Fire damage." The dry needles overhead rustled. The thing behind me breathed in. It was a subtle sound, almost lost under the wind. A long, slow inhale, like bellows pulling air into a banked coal bed. It started low, then rose in pitch until it scraped just below the range of a human voice. "Ella," something said. My name drawn out like a log cracking in a hot fire. I spun around. There was no one. Just the circle of green, the ring of stones, the blackened wall of burned trunks beyond. No footprints in the moss but mine. No disturbed ash at the boundary. The air, though, was warmer. Not pleasant warm, oven warm. My skin prickled, and I realized sweat was beading along my hairline despite the cool day. I backed out of the grove, heart hammering, and didn't stop until I was a good 20 yards into the burn scar. There, the air snapped back to the expected temperature, cool with a faint edge of early snow. My breath steamed normally. My hand shook. I almost called it in, almost told dispatch that I was spooked by a patch of forest that had dodged a fire. Instead, I radioed Blake. "You ever feel watched up by the spared place?" I asked. Silence, then a sigh. "You took something, didn't you?" he said. The question hit harder than it should have. "Just a little carved stone," I admitted. "Figured it was some old marker." "Why?" "You put it back," he said. "Today, before dark." "What is it?" "A promise," he said. "And you don't want to be on the wrong end of whoever made it." I laughed nervously. "Come on, that sounds like something you tell rookies for fun." "I've been here 30 years, he said. I watched that fire run a straight line up that ridge and lay down like it hit glass when it reached those trees. We lost 2 structures and a truck because the wind shifted around that spot. Blew embers sideways instead of through it. Sometimes fire respects old boundaries. Sometimes it gets told to. I hiked back up with the kind of speed I usually reserve for incoming storms. The grove was darker now, shadows lengthening. The ring of stones looked less like an artifact and more like an open mouth. I didn't dare step into it this time. I stood at the edge, unwrapped the token from my bandana, and hesitated only a second before tossing it so it landed with a dull click in the bare earth center. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a breeze moved through the burned forest, carrying with it the dry, papery rattle of ash shifting. The black trunks around the grove seemed to lean inward just slightly, as if nodding. Heat washed over my face, enough to sting my eyes, and then vanished like someone had opened a door to a cooler room. The next morning, when I went up with Blake, the grove was gone. Not gradually, not in a way that made sense. The green oval had been erased. The trees inside the boundary were as black and skeletal as the rest of the slope. The moss was gone, replaced by a thin layer of ash. The ring of stones lay collapsed, scattered as if something had kicked them outward from the center. In the bare earth where the ring had been, a perfect circle of soil was lighter than the surrounding ground, as if it had burned hotter than everything around it. We stood there a long time, saying nothing. "Guess your arrangements changed," I said finally, trying to keep my voice from shaking. Blake didn't answer. His eyes stayed on the pale circle of dirt. When he did speak, his voice was softer than I had ever heard it. "Fire always takes its due," he said. "If something holds it back, it keeps a tab. Maybe you paid it off when you put that piece back. Maybe something else did." I left that assignment a few weeks later. Officially, it was just the end of my seasonal contract. Unofficially, I was grateful to trade that hillside for any other piece of ground. I still work outdoors. I still smell smoke sometimes. But now, when a fire line stops sharply around a patch of trees that should have gone up, I don't walk into the green without thinking very carefully about who or what might be standing there keeping count. I no longer pocket little souvenirs from strange places. Some things in Yellowstone have already been claimed, and when fire goes around them, it's not always an accident. Story 3. The voices from the tower. My name is Carter, and I used to think a fire tower was the safest place you could be in Yellowstone. High above the trees, clear view in every direction. Solid walls between you and whatever is moving in the dark below. That was before I learned that some things don't come from below. Some things come through the speakers. The tower assignment was supposed to be a reward. Quiet post, long stretches of solitude, a chance to prove I could handle responsibility without someone looking over my shoulder. I told everyone it was perfect for me. I like my own company. I liked order. The tower was all about routine. Dawn weather log, mid-morning scan, hourly smoke checks, evening report, lights out. The first week felt almost peaceful. I memorized the ridge lines, learned where the thermal vents gave off just enough steam to look like a column at sunrise. I could tell which shadows were bison and which were stumps just by the way they shifted when the wind changed. At night, I read old case reports and listened to the low hum of the radio, comforted by the knowledge that if anything went wrong, someone could reach me with the press of a button. By week 2, the silence started to get inside my head. There's a kind of quiet in those towers that you don't get anywhere else. It's not really empty. The building creaks. The stove clicks as it cools. The metal railing sings a little when the gusts hit it just right. But beneath all of that, there's a wide hollow stillness, like the pause in a conversation when someone is about to say something important and hasn't decided how. The first time the voice came through, I was half asleep in the bunk with the radio on low at my elbow. I woke up to static, not unusual. The weather had been unstable that day, and the repeater sometimes spat out interference when the clouds built too fast. I reached over to adjust the volume, more annoyed than anything. Then, under the static, I heard it. "Hello." A woman's voice, thin, shaky, not the clipped, practiced cadence of dispatch. "Is anyone there?" I sat up so fast my head hit the bunk rail. "Copy. This is Tower 4. Go ahead." My heart was already ticking up, running through possibilities. Lost hiker, injured camper, someone with a busted radio relay. Silence. The static hissed, rose, fell. "Please," the voice said. "I don't know where I am." They said someone would be listening. That line alone made the hair go up on my arms. We tell visitors a lot of things, but we don't tell them that. They said someone would be listening. That's not our language. That's not a script from any briefing I've ever given. I pushed the MIC button again. "I hear you." Can you give me your name and any landmarks you can see? Any water, roads, lights? Another pause. I could hear what might have been breathing, faint and uneven, like someone trying not to cry. You know me, Carter, she whispered. You know exactly where I am. The breath left my lungs in a rush. I didn't remember telling her my name. I didn't remember hearing it come over the line in her voice. But there it was, hanging between us in the narrow little tower. I had heard that voice before. Not in the park, not on a radio. In a different life, sitting on the edge of a twin bed in an off-campus apartment, listening to someone explain why she couldn't keep trying to reach me if I never called back. Her name was Hannah, and it had been 4 years since we had spoken. I swallowed hard and tried to shove that memory back where it belonged. I think you may have the wrong frequency, I said. My mouth was suddenly dry. This is a restricted channel. Can you repeat your location? The radio crackled, then went dead. I switched dials, checked with dispatch, even called another tower to see if anyone else had picked up stray chatter. Nothing. No one else had heard a thing. By morning, I had half convinced myself it had been a dream. The tower gets hot in the late afternoon, even in shoulder seasons, and it's easy to doze off without realizing it. I wrote it off as a mix of stress and loneliness. The brain replaying old tapes in a new setting. 2 nights later, the voice came back. This time I was fully awake, doing a last sweep with the binoculars before logging the midnight report. The radio was on but quiet. No storms, no fire activity, just the occasional routine check-in from units down in the valleys. I had just set the glasses down when the speaker crackled like someone rubbing sandpaper over metal. Carter. I leaned in. Say again. Static, then clearer. Carter, don't hang up. My hand tightened on the MIC identify yourself. You talked about this view, she said. Remember? You said there was a tower where you could see forever. You said you wanted to bring me here. The world tilted for a moment. I had said something like that once, late at night. More ambition than plan. I had never actually followed through. I think you have the wrong, I began. The radio popped loud enough to make me flinch. Her next words slid out in a way that made my stomach drop. You left me, she said. You don't get to leave me again. Lightning flickered far to the west, too distant to hear, just silent veins of light in the clouds. I checked the channel number. It was the tower's assigned frequency, the one that fed back to the rest of the park network. There was no private line, no way for someone to spoof a direct call. I did what training tells you to do when a caller seems disoriented. I brought it back to basics. What can you see right now? I asked. Trees, water, a road, anything. For the first time, I heard something other than her voice and the static. A low constant roar, like wind in a canyon or water pouring over rocks. Beneath it, faint clicking, almost rhythmic, like metal cooling. Lights, she said slowly. A ring of lights in the trees, and smoke. You're not listening. You never listened. That last sentence wasn't about the park. It was about me, about old conversations and cluttered rooms, about voicemails I never returned. Whoever she was, wherever she was, she shouldn't have known any of that. I felt sweat bead along my spine, even though the tower was cool with the window cracked. My own reflection hung in the glass in front of me, pale and uncertain in the overlapping faint glows from the instrument panel. Behind that ghost version of my face, the mountains were just darker shadows against the sky. Stay where you are, I said. My voice sounded flat. I'm going to get your signal triangulated. I'll keep this line open. She laughed then, soft, humorless. It sounded exactly like it had the night she told me she was tired of waiting for me to show up. You didn't keep it open last time, she said. You closed it. You hung up. Do you remember what you texted instead of calling? I did. God help me, I did. 4 words, each one a flimsy excuse. I could see them in my mind, black on white. I'm working late. On the radio, the roar grew louder. The clicking picked up speed in time with my heartbeat. "Where are you?" I whispered. "Look down," she said. I stepped to the window and pointed the flashlight straight down toward the clearing at the base of the tower. The beam cut through the dark in a narrow column. There was nothing there. Just the patch of scrub and gravel I had seen 100 times. My own footprints from earlier that day still faintly visible where I had cleaned debris from the steps. No campfire ring, no tracks, no ring of lights. I swept the beam outward across the tree line, the slope below, the small creek flashing back a dull reflection. Nothing. "You're not here," I said. "This isn't real." The radio went quiet so fast it felt like someone had yanked a cord. I stood there for a long time, listening to the tiny clicks of cooling metal and the blood beating in my ears. Eventually, I filed a short, vague note in the log about interference and possible unauthorized use of frequencies. I didn't mention the words. I didn't mention the way my own guilt had been thrown back at me in someone else's voice. Over the next month, the pattern continued. Not every night, never at the same time twice. Sometimes days would pass with nothing but weather alerts and routine dispatch traffic. Then, usually when the sky was heavy and the air tasted like impending rain, the static would thicken and her voice would slide through. She talked about things no one on the channel should have known. Inside jokes from years ago, the exact phrasing of a fight we had on a sidewalk 3 towns away from this park. The way my father's funeral smelled like damp wool and lilies, always sandwiched between half-formed fragments about trees and smoke and lights. I sent in 3 separate maintenance requests for the radio. Techs hiked up, ran diagnostics, swapped out components. Every time they told me the same thing. The equipment was in perfect working order. "You're probably catching spillover from civilians on a nearby band," one of them suggested. "Happens sometimes when the weather stacks weird." "Right," I said. I didn't ask how a stranger on a random channel would know that I had once left a birthday dinner early by pretending to get an emergency call. The last night in the tower, the storm finally hit. Rain hammered the roof like handfuls of gravel. The wind shoved at the walls, making the whole structure shudder. Lightning turned the windows into momentary mirrors, flashing my own pale face back at me over and over. I had just finished logging the 3 a.m. weather check when the radio clicked on by itself. No static this time, no build-up, just a voice, clear and close, like she was standing right behind me. "Come down," she said. "You can't see it from up there. You never see anything from up there." Every survival instinct I had screamed no. You don't go wandering around a metal tower in a thunderstorm. You certainly don't climb down into trees that are swaying like they're trying to rip their roots free. I stayed where I was, knuckles white on the edge of the desk. "You left me alone," she said. The words overlapped with a thunderclap, but I heard them anyway. "You left me in the dark. Now you get to see how it feels. Where are you?" My voice broke. I didn't care how it sounded. Thunder rolled again, closer. For a second, all the lights in the tower dimmed and came back up. "Right under you," she whispered. I didn't look down. Instead, I grabbed the binoculars and swung them in a slow, shaking arc across the tree line. In one flash of lightning, I saw them. Not lights exactly, but pale shapes between the trunks, as if someone had hung lanterns too low to the ground, circling the clearing. They flickered once, twice, then vanished. The next flash showed nothing at all. When morning finally came, the storm moved on and the radio fell silent. I climbed down on legs that barely wanted to hold me. At the base of the tower, the ground was soaked, muddy, littered with twigs and leaves. There were no footprints but mine. No signs of a camp, no scorch marks, nothing. I put in for a transfer the following week. Now, months later, I still wake up at 3:17 a.m., the time stamped on the last weather log from that tower. I keep a small handheld radio on the nightstand. It's turned off, batteries out, but sometimes I catch myself staring at it, waiting. I don't know if the voice was something in my own head, twisting lonely memories into something sharper, or if the park found a way to wear an old regret like a mask. I only know this. Whatever spoke to me used the one person I most wanted to forget as bait. And when you hear someone you failed calling for you from the middle of a place that doesn't forgive carelessness, it's very hard to trust that any voice on the other end of a line is really asking to be saved. Story 4. The body in the ravine. My name is Nora, and this is the version of the report that never went into the system. The official paperwork for Case 27B reads like 100 other Yellowstone incidents. Solo male camper, mid-40s, left a designated site, suffered a fall in rugged terrain, remains found and recovered with signs of animal scavenging. Cause of death: blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. Contributing factors: poor judgment, disregard for posted warnings. End of story. Except it wasn't the end of the story. It wasn't even the beginning. We got the call on the second morning of a cold snap in early October. A party of 3 had checked out of a backcountry site one day late and hiked back to the trailhead without their 4th member. According to the group, he had gone off alone just before sunset to get better shots of the ridge line and never came back. They searched for 2 hours and then decided to wait until morning. By then, a dusting of snow had fallen, and the trail back to camp was already softened by wind. When I asked why they hadn't contacted us sooner, the trip leader just shrugged and said, "He's stubborn." We thought he was playing some survival purist game. That stuck with me, the casual way people talk about another human being they've left behind in a canyon. We mobilized like we always do. Helicopter requested but delayed by weather. Ground teams divided into grid sectors. Coordinates of the last known point loaded into our GPS units. I was assigned as lead on one of the primary search lines. We hiked out under a low white sky that made the entire valley feel smaller, like the ceiling had dropped a few feet overnight. The first odd thing we found was his camera bag. It sat on a flat rock overlooking a steep drainage, centered almost perfectly, lenses capped, zipper half open. No snow on top, only around it, like it had been placed there after the wind eased. Beside it lay a pair of gloves, fingers aligned, not dropped or flung. People who are lost or panicking don't usually arrange their belongings in neat lines. They scatter them. I called it in, then clipped the bag to my pack. One of the newer rangers suggested maybe he had set it down to climb somewhere. We all looked at the rock face below. Sheer, slick with a thin glaze of ice, broken only by a few scraggly shrubs clinging to cracks. No chalk, no rope, no marks. It didn't look like a place anyone would decide to scramble down without gear. We moved on. Later that afternoon, we reached a narrow saddle between 2 ridges, an area we knew was laced with old game trails and occasional unofficial spur paths that visitors liked to pretend were secret routes. As we checked junctions and called his name, I noticed one of the motion-triggered cameras strapped to a lodgepole pine was facing the wrong way. These cameras are workhorses. They watch animal corridors, record human traffic in sensitive areas, help us see patterns we would never catch with daylight patrols alone. We mount them carefully, angled to capture the maximum stretch of trail. This one had been turned to stare straight at the trunk of another tree a few feet away. No view of the trail at all, just bark. I flagged it for later review, straightened it to the correct angle, and tried to ignore the way the plastic casing felt slightly warm under my fingers in the cold air. That night, we made camp in a clearing just below tree line, close enough to the last known point that we could be back there within an hour at first light. Snow fell in light, dry flakes, more like dust than real weather. The temperature dropped hard once the sun checked out. We ate quickly, wrote our notes by headlamp, and zipped ourselves into sleeping bags that never quite seem as warm as the brochure promises. Sometime past midnight, something started circling the camp. It wasn't unusual to have wildlife move through at night. You get used to hearing elk hooves, the soft pad of coyotes, the occasional distant bellow of a frustrated bison. This was different. Whatever it was stayed just beyond the edge of our light, pacing deliberately. No clear footfalls, just a faint crunch, then a pause, then a faint crunch again, always behind whichever tent the current watcher wasn't facing. We took turns sitting up, watching, calling out softly, "Hey bear, keep moving." Standard routine. No eye shine flashed back at us. No huffing breath, no snapping branches. Just that slow, assessing movement. At one point, one of the guys swore he heard breathing, long and controlled, near his tent wall. But when he opened the flap, there was only cold air and drifting snow. By morning, the snow around camp looked undisturbed. No clear tracks, only minor shifts in the drifts that could have been wind. We packed up feeling more tired than we wanted to admit and pushed into steeper ground. We found him on the second day. It was one of the volunteers who spotted a scrap of bright blue fabric down in a ravine, snagged on low brush. We fanned out along the rim until we could see the full shape. A body lying on its back against a slope of rocks, arms tucked close as if asleep. The snow around him was oddly clean. No scatter, no struggle marks, just a soft halo where flakes had landed and melted, landed and melted. Protocol took over. We marked the site, photographed everything, and carefully made our way down. Up close, the scene made less sense. If he had fallen from above, there should have been some sign of impact in the snow or the soil, a trench where his body had slid, a bruised line of disturbed vegetation. Instead, he looked as if he had been placed there. There were no scrapes on his hands, no torn fingernails, nothing to indicate a desperate attempt to stop his descent. His backpack was missing. So were his boots. His socks were clean. No blood, no mud, no thorns jammed into the fabric. Every identifying item you would expect to find on a body in the backcountry, wallet, keys, phone, permit copy, was gone, except for the ring. His wedding band had been pushed deep into his mouth, not lodged accidentally, not caught on broken teeth, placed. I saw the glint of metal when we checked for airway obstructions, shone my light in, and felt my stomach drop. I'll never forget the image of that circle of gold resting against his tongue. We withdrew, documented, did everything the book demands. The medical examiner would later tell us the primary trauma was consistent with a fall, that the injuries matched an impact from a certain height onto rock. What the paperwork didn't say was that the fractures didn't line up with any obvious drop above the ravine. The slopes were wrong. The angles were wrong. There was nowhere clean for a body to have launched from and landed where he did without leaving more evidence behind. As we secured the area, I noticed tracks leading away from the scene. Not boot prints, not animal paw marks. Bare impressions, elongated, spaced a little too far apart, like someone walking on the balls of their feet. They moved up the ravine wall and into a stand of trees, then faded where the snow had drifted deeper. I called another ranger over, heart thudding. "Do you see that?" He squinted, frowned, and shook his head. "Snow melt shadows. Don't start seeing ghosts, Nora." I stopped talking about the prints. Back at headquarters, we pulled the trail camera images from the area leading up to the ravine. In the hours before the man vanished, the camera showed normal traffic, his group hiking together, then splitting when he veered off toward a side ridge with his camera bag. After that, the footage turned wrong. On 3 separate cameras, the angle shifted within a 10-minute window. Each one had been rotated away from the trail to face blank trees or open sky. The last image clearly capturing him showed a figure standing a few yards behind him on the ridge. Tall, still, head tilted. No face, just a darker shape within the dark of the trees. The other rangers shrugged it off as a trick of contrast. A branch, a shadow, a coat tossed over a stump. I wanted to believe them. I tried. I wrote my report that night, sitting under the harsh fluorescent hum of the office, hands stiff from cold and fatigue. I listed the facts, time, location, weather, group details, recovery notes. When I got to the part about the ring, I hesitated. That detail went in. You can't hide something like that in the official record. But the bare prints, the feeling of something pacing our camp, the turned cameras and the shape on the ridge, those stayed out. Internal Affairs reviewed the case a week later. Standard when a body comes back with unanswered questions. I sat across from a man with a neutral tie and neutral eyes while he asked me whether I felt there had been any negligence on the part of the park in posting warnings, whether our response time had been adequate, whether we had fully educated the group on off-trail risks. I answered everything honestly and watched him type. the little cursor blinking across words like contributing factors and visitor behavior. At the end, he closed his laptop and said, "Is there anything else you think we should know, Officer Johnston?" For a heartbeat, I considered telling him everything. The token-like arrangement of the belongings, the sense of being watched in the dark, the ring pushed where it didn't belong, like a message written in flesh instead of ink, the prints that didn't match any species chart on our wall. Instead, I heard myself say, "No, that's all." He nodded, satisfied, and moved on to the next file. Here's the part that keeps me up. A week after we closed 27B, I woke to find a set of faint, elongated impressions in the light frost outside my cabin. Not clear enough to photograph, not distinct enough to prove anything. Just a suggestion of weight having passed by my door, the spacing eerily similar to what I had seen in the ravine. I told myself it was runoff, ice melt patterns, my own imagination knitting shadows into footsteps. I keep telling myself that every time I walk past the wall of missing persons flyers, and see how many of them list left established trail as a last known action. The park likes clean stories. A bad decision, a simple fall, animals doing what animals do. We tuck the rough edges away so visitors will keep coming, so they won't see how much we don't understand. I used to believe in that simplification. It made the job easier. Now when I lead searches, I pay attention to the spaces where cameras go blind for no good reason, to the places where people vanish without leaving the kind of trace physics says they should. I log what I'm supposed to log and leave the rest in a separate ledger in my head. Because I've started to suspect there's something out here that knows our roots, our blind spots, our protocols. Something that understands how to stage a scene to look like carelessness and gravity. Something that walks just outside the angles our equipment can see. And whatever it is, it's getting better at arranging bodies to match our expectations, right up until you notice the one small detail that doesn't fit, like a ring pushed where no human hand would ever put it by accident. Story 5. The day that repeated my name is Aiden, and there's one winter patrol in Yellowstone that I pretend never happened. On the calendar, it's just another block of shifts I worked 2 seasons ago. In my head, it's a day that refused to stay in its own place, a loop that folded over itself until I wasn't sure which version of me was leaving which set of tracks. Winter work was the only part of this job I truly loved. The crowds are gone. The animals keep their distance. And the park finally feels like the quiet, dangerous thing it really is. I knew my snowmobile routes by heart. Closed roads to check for downed trees, shuttered cabins to inspect for damage, radio repeaters to brush free of ice. It was all schedule and routine, the kind of predictable structure that calms a brain like mine. That morning started like every other. The sky was a hard, bright blue, the kind that makes the snow look almost metallic. The air cut at any exposed skin, but there was barely a breeze, and my machine fired up on the first try. I signed out of the station, noted my route on the board, and told the others I would be back before dark. The plan was simple: run north on an old service road, swing past 2 backcountry patrol cabins, then cut east across an open meadow to check a weather station before looping home. I had done it so many times that my hands knew when to turn before my eyes saw the markers. About an hour in, somewhere between the first cabin and the meadow, I noticed the tracks. A set of boot prints crossed my snowmobile trail at a sharp angle, heading downslope toward a stand of trees. Fresh, crisp edges. No wind softening yet. Human, medium size, standard pattern from park issue winter boots. That alone was odd enough. No one else had signed out on this route, and no public access should have been anywhere near here with the gates closed. I slowed, then stopped. The engine idled under me, a low, steady vibration. I slipped off, let the silence settle around me, and crouched to study the prints. They weren't over my track. They cut it. That meant whoever made them had been out here before me. I followed them a short way, just far enough to see that they continued in a straight line to the tree line, then vanished into deeper drifts where the shadows swallowed detail. I weighed the options. Training said, don't follow unknown tracks off route alone in deep winter unless there are signs of distress. The prints were neat, regular, no staggering or dragging. Whoever it was, They were moving with purpose. I backed away, climbed onto the sled, and made a note to radio in from the first cabin. The cabin sat in a small cluster of trees, its roof loaded with snow, windows dark. I parked, knocked ice from my boots, and went through the usual checklist. Door secure. No sign of forced entry. Chimney intact. No wildlife damage. Inside, my breath smoked in the still air as I checked the logbook on the table. A simple spiral notebook where rangers sign in and occasionally jot notes for each other. The last entry was from 3 weeks earlier, a familiar scrawl from one of the guys on swing shift. Below it, in handwriting that looked disturbingly like mine, was today's date and my name. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the curve of the letters. The way the A hooked a little too far right, the way the D leaned, it was my style. But I hadn't been here yet today. I had just opened the door. Cold slid under my jacket in a thin, mean line. I checked the edges of the page. The ink was dry. No smears, no indentation from writing over something else. I flipped back a few sheets, half expecting to find other phantom versions of my name, but everything else looked normal. Gloving transfer, I muttered to myself. Old note, new date in your head. The explanation sounded weak even to me. I wrote another entry beneath the strange one, pressing the pen harder than necessary. Patrol Campbell, Cabin 12, 10:42 hours. Inspection clear. The letters looked the same. Back outside, the boot prints from earlier nagged at me. I tried raising dispatch on the radio, but a wall of static answered. It happens in those valleys sometimes, the signal bouncing wrong. I told myself I would call from higher ground and pushed on toward the meadow. That's where everything started to slide sideways. The meadow was a broad open stretch of white that I had crossed hundreds of times. A single dead tree stood near the center like a marker, its bark stripped by age and weather. On clear days, you could see your own tracks trailing behind you all the way back to the tree line. Today, as I came out of the woods, I saw 3 sets of tracks. One was the line I was making now, a clean curve from the trees. Crossing it at an angle was a second snowmobile track, older edges softened, but still readable, heading toward the dead tree from the opposite side. And weaving between them was a set of boot prints. My boot prints. The exact tread, the exact size, that same slight toe out on the left foot I had seen in the unknown trail earlier. I stopped so abruptly the sled fishtailed. My breath fogged the visor. I lifted it, letting the cold slap my face awake. "This isn't funny," I said to the empty air. No one answered. The engine's idle suddenly sounded too loud. I killed it. The silence that dropped into its place was so complete, it made my ears ring. I swung off and walked to where the 3 paths met. The boot prints from the west crossed the older snowmobile line, then continued toward the tree. The ones I was making now marched up beside them like they were trying to match pace. I followed both sets toward the center of the meadow. The tree up close was bigger than it looked from the edge. Its dead branches twisted against the white sky. At its base, in the shallow wind-carved hollow around the trunk, the tracks overlapped in a muddled knot, then stopped. No circle back, no wandering off, no sign of anyone kneeling or sitting. Just an abrupt end where step became nothing. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the featureless snow. My own pulse thudded behind my eyes. You learn to read tracks out here like another language. This looked like a sentence with no period. It simply trailed off mid-air. My radio crackled then, sudden and sharp in the quiet. I grabbed for it like a lifeline. "Aiden, what's your position?" The voice was my supervisor's, but distorted, as if coming from very far away. "Crossing Meadow 12, I replied. "Cabin check complete. I'm seeing odd sign, possible multiple passes on this route. Have we had any unlogged patrols today?" Static hissed back, then faintly, "You already checked that meadow. Don't loop it again. Head east and come in." My skin went cold under all the layers. "Say again." "This is my first pass through this sector today." No answer. Just a burst of garbled noise and a high whining squeal that made me pull the handset away from my ear. Enough, I thought. I was tired. I was letting a few weird coincidences snowball into paranoia, and I was wasting daylight arguing with a malfunctioning radio in a haunted-feeling field. I walked back to the sled, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder at the dead tree. The air around it felt thicker, like the space it occupied was heavier than the rest of the meadow. The engine finally caught on the third try. I swung the sled in a wide arc, planning to cut toward the weather station and then home. But as I crested a small rise on the eastern edge of the meadow, my stomach dropped. The same meadow stretched out before me again. The same dead tree, the same tangle of overlapping tracks at its base. For a moment, some part of my brain refused to believe what my eyes were seeing. I checked the compass mounted on the handlebars. The needle pointed steadily north. I checked the handheld GPS clipped to my chest. The little arrow marking my position blinked on the western edge of Meadow 12, exactly where I had been 5 minutes earlier. I turned the sled in a slow circle, watching the GPS map rotate. No matter which way I faced, the position marker didn't move. Panic presses on you differently in the cold. It's heavy, sluggish, like trying to run through waist-deep snow. Every instinct screamed at me to keep going, to push harder in some direction, any direction, until something changed. Another part of me, the part that has sat through too many search and rescue debriefs, whispered that moving fast when you don't understand what's happening is how people die. I shut off the engine. The sudden silence felt like the realest thing I had touched all day. I stood there, one hand on the handlebars, and listened. No wind, no distant crack of branches, just a faint, almost subsonic hum I thought at first was in my own ears until I realized it was coming from under my boots. The snow beneath me vibrated just barely, like something far below the surface was turning. "Okay," I said aloud, voice shaking. "I get it. I'm not going to chase it." I didn't try to ride out again. Instead, I took 3 careful steps away from the sled, then 3 more, always facing the same direction, counting my breaths. At 10 paces, I stopped and looked back. The sled was where I had left it. The tree was still ahead, but farther now, the tangle of tracks at its base a little smaller. Behind me, for the first time that day, there was untouched snow. One clean line of my footprints marching back toward the machine. The humming underfoot lessened. I walked back slowly, resisting the urge to glance around for other versions of myself staggering across other years' worth of patrols. When I started the engine again, the GPS blipped once, then caught up, the little arrow jumping to a new position, eastern edge of Meadow 12, right where it should have been all along. The rest of the route home passed without incident. The radios behaved. The cabins ahead were as ordinary as weathered wood and cold stoves can be. Back at the station, I didn't mention the duplicate log entry or the looping meadow. I wrote a bland report about minor interference and recommended a calibration check for the GPS. My supervisor signed off without comment. A week later, curiosity finally overrode common sense. I pulled the Cabin 12 logbook from storage and flipped to the page for that day. There was only one entry in my handwriting. The strange duplicate had vanished, if it had ever been there at all. Sometimes on nights when the wind rattles the windows just right, I dream of that meadow. In the dream, there aren't just 3 sets of tracks, but dozens, crisscrossing in layers of ice and powder, all with my stride, my boots, my small hesitations. They circle that dead tree like rings in a cut trunk. Each one a year, I almost didn't make it back. I still run winter patrols. I still cross Meadow 12. But I do it once, straight through. No day tours, no chasing oddities in the snow. If the GPS glitches or the radio coughs up a familiar voice telling me to go around again, I kill the engine and wait. Out here, time is just another terrain feature. Most days it behaves. Some days it folds. And on those days, the only smart move might be to stand still and hope the loop closes without taking you with it. Story 6. The double on the ridge. My name is Haley, and the first time I realized something in Yellowstone was learning how to wear my face. I was sitting in a training room watching myself on a television I didn't remember standing in front of. On the screen, I was in full uniform, smiling that professional ranger smile, delivering the standard front country safety orientation. I knew the script by heart. I had given that talk 100 times. But halfway through the video, I said something I had never said in my life. If you decide to ignore the closure signs on Cascade Ridge, the version of me on the screen warned, understand that we may not be able to bring you back in one piece. The room laughed politely. My supervisor chuckled and said something about vivid phrasing, Bennett. I sat there with my hands locked together in my lap, staring at my own lips shaping words I had no memory of choosing. We didn't have a closure on Cascade Ridge when that video was filmed. We didn't have a closure there at all until 3 weeks later, after the day I lost. It was supposed to be a simple off-season assignment. Post new warning placards along a trail that was being shut down for rockfall and unstable ground. No crowds, no chatter, just me, my pack, a staple gun, and a stack of bright yellow signs telling people to stay away from places they could get themselves killed. I remember being almost excited for the quiet. Front country work is noise and questions and breaking up arguments between tourists who think the rules apply to everyone but them. A solo hike with a clear task felt like a day off that someone decided to pay me for. The morning was overcast, the sky a flat sheet of white that made the snow patches glow and the trees look like charcoal sketches. I parked at the empty lot, signed out on the log, and started up the trail. The first odd thing happened less than a mile in. A group of 3 hikers came around a bend toward me, heading down. Their clothes didn't match any of the usual commercial tour outfits. No matching vests or branded hats, just neutral layers, faces I couldn't quite focus on. As they drew level, one of them, a woman with dark hair half tucked under a beanie, smiled and said, "Morning, Hales. Only my family calls me that. Not co-workers, not visitors." I opened my mouth to ask if we knew each other, but the 3 of them were already past, moving in oddly synchronized steps, boots landing almost at the same instant, like a single creature with 3 bodies. When I turned to call after them, they were farther down the trail than they should have been for the few seconds I had my back turned. No crunch of accelerated footsteps, no slipping or sliding. Just distance that didn't make sense. I told myself I was imagining it, focused on the task. At each junction, I checked the map, chose a tree, and posted a sign. Trail closed beyond this point. Unstable conditions. The routine settled my nerves. Measure, level, staple, move on. Somewhere around the 3rd sign, I noticed my shadow. At first, it was just a passing flicker at the edge of my vision, the kind of thing you blame on shifting clouds. But then the pattern became clear. When I lifted my arm to check the time, the shadow's arm rose a beat late. When I pushed hair back under my beanie, the dark shape on the ground mimicked the movement just behind. The lag was small, half a second at most. But once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. I tested it. Wiggled my fingers, tilted my head. Each time, the shadow followed on a slight delay, like a video and audio track knocked just out of sync. The light was diffuse enough that there shouldn't have been a sharp shadow at all. I kept moving. The air felt thicker, like I was walking through water. The forest sounds, the wind, the occasional distant jay, faded to a muffled hush. At the next planned posting point, I rounded a curve and froze. There, nailed neatly to a tree beside the trail, was one of our closure signs. Same wording, same bright yellow background, same metal staples pinning it to the bark. At the bottom, in black permanent marker, were my initials and that day's date. I checked the stack in my hand. Every sign was still there, none missing. My marker was capped in my pocket. The signature on the posted sign was my handwriting. Same looping H, same hurried slant on the B. My heart started to pound in that sick, low way, like it was trying to hide behind my ribs. I peeled one glove off with my teeth and ran bare fingers along the edge of the sign. The paper was dry, no condensation, no smear. It hadn't just been tacked there in the last 2 minutes. It had been there long enough to settle into the bark. I backed away, turned, and looked down the trail. The snow behind me lay mostly undisturbed, save for my own footprints and the lingering softened marks of the earlier group. No extra trail led past where I stood. No churned patch where someone could have circled around me unseen. Okay, I said out loud, because the silence was starting to press on me. This isn't funny. The trees didn't answer. My radio clipped to my shoulder remained a dull black rectangle. I kept going. The trail narrowed, cutting into a steep hillside. The drop-off to my right slid down into a tangle of brush and boulders. Ahead, I could see the overlook where we planned to post the final, largest sign. Beyond that, the closure would be total. As I approached, the sense of wrongness coiled tighter. The air tasted metallic, like I had put my tongue on a battery. My teeth ached. The closer I got to the overlook, the more the world seemed to lag around the edges. Movements felt delayed, like the air was taking an extra second to get out of my way. There's a metal railing at that overlook, a simple waist-high barrier painted park service brown. I've leaned on it 100 times, watched the water cut through the rocks below, answered endless questions about how deep the canyon is. I've also seen what happens when someone leans too far. As I stepped into the clearing, I saw myself standing at that railing. She, me, had both hands resting on the top bar, head tilted slightly as she looked down. Same uniform, same beanie, same flyaway hair escaping at the nape of the neck. For a moment, I thought there must be a mirror, some weird trick of glass. But there was nothing reflective in front of her except open air and distance. My stomach lurched. I blinked hard. When my eyes reopened, the space beside the railing was empty. No double, just the scuffed dirt where countless feet had stood. In the faint reflection on the metal rail itself, though, I could still see two figures. One where I stood, one a half step closer to the edge. My shadow stretched long on the ground behind me. It didn't line up with my feet. Footsteps crunched on the trail just behind my left shoulder. Slow, deliberate, in time with a slight delay of the shadow. I didn't turn around. Posting final closure sign at Overlook 3, I said into the radio, though I hadn't touched the push button. My voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere else, half a second off from the movement of my lips. Conditions unstable. Recommend full seasonal closure. Static answered. Beneath it, very softly, another voice said, "Don't turn around, Haley." It sounded like me. The urge to look was almost overwhelming. Every instinct screamed to identify whatever was at my back. But another instinct, older and less verbal, told me that recognizing the wrong thing as myself was a line I didn't want to cross. I took the sign with shaking hands and stapled it to the post at the trail's end. Each thunk of the stapler sounded like it echoed too long. When I finished, I stepped backward toward the trail, never taking my eyes off the spot where my double had stood. The footsteps behind me matched, always a fraction behind, always landing just where mine had been. When I reached the bend that would take me out of sight of the overlook, I finally risked a glance over my shoulder. No one was there. No second set of prints appeared in the snow. But my shadow stretched along the curve of the hill, still moved wrong, lagging, catching up, like something had tried the timing once and not quite perfected it. The hike down blurred. 1 minute I was on the ridge, the next I was signing back in at the trailhead, pen scratching my name on the sheet. The clock on the board said it was nearly dark. My watch said I had been gone less than 3 hours. The route should have taken at least 5 with the posting work. My supervisor frowned when I came in. "You all right? You were back early, and you didn't have to redo the ridge signs. They looked fine after the rockfall." "Redo?" I asked. My voice sounded hollow to my own ears. He flipped through a clipboard. The maintenance note from, last week. "You signed off on that whole section already. We just needed a confirmation. You sure you're getting enough sleep?" Later in the break room, they queued up an internal video to show some new staff how not to talk to visitors. There I was on the screen again, at Cascade Ridge, gesturing at a gleaming new closure sign, telling the camera that beyond that point, the park didn't belong to people anymore, that if they stepped past, something else might decide to step in. I have no memory of that recording session. None. Now, when I walk past mirrors in the visitor center, I keep my eyes front. I don't catch my reflection in windows after dark. I avoid solo assignments on that ridge. And when I have to post a new sign, I bring someone with me, if only as a witness that there was just one of me up there. Because here's the part one can't shake. Whatever out there tried on my mannerisms, my face, my voice, it was getting better at it. Smoother, closer to perfect. And if there's one thing scarier than something that wants to hurt you, it's something that wants to replace you so completely that no one can tell which version of you came back down the trail. Story 7. The thing that hunts with wolves. My name is Nolan, and this is the story I never put in my resignation letter. On paper, I left Yellowstone for family reasons after 10 years working wildlife in Lamar Valley. The truth is that my last night patrol out there convinced me that something else is hunting the same ground we pretend to manage, and it's better at the job than we are. Lamar at dusk is the kind of beautiful that makes your chest hurt. The light goes copper. The hills roll out in layered shadows, and the wolves start to move. People come from all over the world just to stand by the roadside with spotting scopes, hoping for a glimpse. My job was to protect those people from their own bad decisions and to protect the animals from them, too. That night, late in the season, the valley felt almost empty. The bigger crowds had thinned. The air had that sharp metallic edge that says winter is testing the locks. I was alone in the truck, making one last pass to check for illegal campers and spotlight for poachers. A storm front was stacking along the horizon, but the stars above Lamar were still clear, bright enough that the snow patches glowed like ghost pools. For the first hour, it was routine. A pair of elk near the river, a lone bison lumbering along the shoulder, a fox that stared at my headlights like it had never seen a vehicle before. I wrote a warning for a van parked too close to a pullout and moved on, drinking coffee that tasted like burned plastic just to keep my hands busy. Then I saw the carcass. It was just off the road, half hidden in a patch of willows. An elk, big and healthy looking even in death, laid out on its side with the chest cavity neatly opened. Not torn, not ripped. Opened. The cut line along the hide was too clean and too straight for wolf work. No ragged edges, no tufts of hair scattered around. The organs that should have spilled were gone. The legs were folded almost tidily underneath, like someone had posed it. My first thought was poachers. It fit the pattern. Take the prime cuts, leave the rest for scavengers, get out before anyone notices. But the usual signs were missing. No drag marks, no tire tracks nearby, no footprints in the soft ground except a few deer trails and my own prints from when I stepped out to check. I radioed in a possible illegal kill and took photos from every angle, the flash popping harsh white against the dark. The stillness around that carcass felt wrong. Usually, even a fresh kill has some life around it. Ravens watching from branches, a distant coyote listening for an opening. This one was silent. The only sound was the slow tick of my cooling engine. I was back in the truck logging the coordinates when I heard the first howl. I know wolf voices. 10 years out here, and you could wake me from a dead sleep and I could tell you the difference between a contact call and a rally cry, between a pup complaining and an adult warning. This sound didn't fit any of those. It started low, almost like a moan, then climbed, not just in pitch, but in number. One voice became several, then many, all hitting the same note, all rising and falling in perfect synchronization. The hair on my arms lifted. Wolves do chorus, but not like that. They overlap, weave in and out, individuals threading through the group. This was one sound split into pieces. I killed the engine and stepped out, letting the cold close over me. The howling was coming from deeper in the valley, beyond the line of willows, somewhere along the slope that leads up toward the northern hills. I grabbed my spotlight and swept it across the dark, looking for eye shine. Nothing. Not a single glint. The howl circled, the direction shifting without any accompanying movement in the brush. One moment they sounded like they were above me, the next like they were behind, then suddenly way out across the flats. No crunch of paws on snow, no snapping twigs. Just that eerie, perfectly timed call, like a recording played through invisible speakers. "Knock it off," I muttered, more to myself than anything, and swung the spotlight again. This time it caught something. 2 sets of tracks intersected the narrow trail that led away from the carcass. One set was exactly what I expected from a big canid. Deep paw prints, nails evident, stride easy and confident. The other set made my throat go dry. Boot prints. Human. Heavy treads similar to the kind you see on serious backcountry gear. They walked right alongside the paw prints, matching their length and spacing so closely it looked like a single creature with 2 different feet. Whoever it was hadn't been dragged. There were no stumbles, no signs of someone being forced. Just 2 beings moving as one. I followed them with the beam, watching as they veered off the game trail and up toward a darker line of trees. About 30 yards out, the human prints stopped. The paws continued alone. Back in the truck, my radio crackled with a brief broken burst of static, like someone had almost keyed the MIC and thought better of it. I called in the tracks, asked if any patrols were in the area on foot. Negative, came the answer. I was the only unit in that sector. As long as they're not shooting, leave it, my supervisor said. We'll sweep it in daylight. Leaving it was the last thing I wanted to do. But I also knew what happens to rangers who chase shadows off the road at night in rough country. They end up as names on plaques with small wreaths in spring. I drove on. The howling faded as I put distance between myself and the carcass, but the valley didn't feel any less watched. Every time my hand drifted toward the spotlight, I had the sense that something out there was waiting for me to swing that beam a little too far off the road, to lean a little too far into the dark. An hour later, heading back toward the station, I saw the fire. It was on a rise above the valley floor, in a gap between 2 stands of trees. A small, contained flame, too steady and orange to be anything but human-made. No campsites were permitted there. No work crews were scheduled. I cursed under my breath and turned off onto the narrow dirt track that curved up toward it. As I got closer, the fire shrank, then vanished altogether, like someone had dropped a blanket over it. I killed my headlights and rolled the last few yards on idle, heart thumping so loud it felt like it was shaking the steering column. The clearing at the top was empty. No tent, no coals, no smoke. Just a circle of stones in the snow, blackened on the inside, as if they had hosted many fires, but none tonight. In the center of the ring lay a pile of bones. Not random. Arranged. Long elk bones interspersed with shorter ones, all laid in a rough wheel pattern, spokes pointing outward. I stepped out slowly, every sense straining. The cold bit straight through my uniform. My breath hung in front of me in quick, shallow puffs. There was a sound then, from the tree line. Not the howl this time. A single low chuckle, half human, half something else. I spun, raising the light. The beam caught eyes, dozens of them, at varying heights, just inside the shadowed trees. Wolf eyes reflecting green-white. But behind them, taller, farther back, 2 more points of reflection, higher than any man I had ever met could stand. The shape they marked was wrong. Too long in the shoulder, too narrow in the waist. Hanging from that tall, dark outline was an elk skull. I knew that even before the spotlight picked out the curve of the antlers. Fresh blood slicked the bone, dripping slowly onto something pale at its feet. A mask, my mind supplied, because the other option was to accept that something had grown into that shape. The wolves didn't move. They ringed the figure like obedient dogs waiting for a hand signal. The air hummed with their held-back energy. The skull-headed thing turned slightly, just enough that the empty sockets faced me. When it spoke, the voice wasn't loud, but the words carried clean all the same. You shouldn't be here alone, Nolan. Hearing my name from that hollow bone-echoing rasp snapped me out of whatever root-deep trance had pinned me. I stumbled backward, almost went down in the snow, and scrambled for the truck. I didn't remember starting the engine. I didn't remember turning the wheel. One moment I was on my knees in the cold, the next the valley was unraveling in my rearview mirror, my tires chewing gravel as I barreled back toward the main road with my lights off and my heart hammering hard enough to blur my vision. When I finally dared to look back, there was nothing on the rise. No fire, No eyes, just the dim outline of trees against the sky. By the time I reached the station, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely fill out the nightly log. I wrote down the carcass. I wrote down the suspicious cuts and the human tracks. I wrote unidentified figures at a distance and recommended increased patrols. I didn't mention the mask. I didn't mention my name spoken by something that owned a ring of wolves. 2 days later, we sent a team to check the site in daylight. The elk carcass was gone. Every scrap of it. Not dragged, not scattered. Gone. The circle of stones on the rise was still there, but the bones had been reduced to powder, sifted smooth, as if someone had taken great care to erase the pattern. One of the older rangers pulled me aside afterward. His face was lines and windburn, eyes as tired as mine felt. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked quietly. Or something like it. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Finally, I said, "I saw enough." He nodded like that was all the confirmation he needed. You won't find that in any manual, but the stories are older than the park. People who wear heads that aren't theirs, people who call the predators instead of fearing them. You run when you see that. You did right. I handed in my resignation a month later. I told them I was burned out, that the long nights had gotten to me, that I wanted to be closer to home. They shook my hand, threw me a cake in the break room, told me I would be back someday because guys like me never really leave the field. Maybe they're right. Maybe I'll miss the valley enough that the memories loosen their grip. But every time I hear a wolf documentary on TV, every time a nature app on my phone plays a recorded howl, part of me waits for the moment when the sound slips just a fraction into that too-perfect chorus I heard in Lamar. The one that wasn't calling to other wolves at all. It was calling to something that stands a little too tall, wears an elk's face like a crown, and knows my name. These are the 7 accounts that Yellowstone's official records will never acknowledge. 7 rangers who encountered something beyond their training, beyond their protocols, beyond the neat explanations we offer tourists at visitor centers. If you've made it this far, you understand why these stories stayed buried. They don't fit the narrative of a park that can be managed, understood, controlled. They suggest that beneath Yellowstone's geysers and wildlife corridors, something older is watching, learning, adapting. If you've experienced something similar in any national park, share your story in the comments. The more we compare these encounters, the clearer the pattern becomes. And maybe, just maybe, understanding what's out there is the first step towards staying safe. If you found value in these accounts, hit that like button for Mr. Darkmare. Your support helps us continue bringing you authentic investigations into the unexplained. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay on the trails, and remember, some boundaries exist for reasons we are only beginning to understand.